The camera never blinked. It never looked away. And because of that, a secret meant to stay buried was forced into the light. The sun was high in the sky, hanging heavy like it always did on weekday afternoons. The kind of sun that makes people feel safe, comfortable. The street was alive with noise, engines humming, shoes scraping pavement, distant laughter drifting between buildings. Cars rolled past slowly, stopping at red lights, starting again without urgency. People walked with their heads down, phones in their hands, minds elsewhere. Life moved forward in its usual rhythm, unaware that for one man time was already running out. At exactly 2:17 p.m. a shadow stretched across the sidewalk. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't rushed, just a shape moving where shapes always move. A figure entered the frame of a security camera mounted above a small storefront. The lens was old, scratched, forgotten by most, but it was watching, always watching. The figure walked with calm steps, purposeful, no hesitation in the stride, no panic in the posture. This was not someone lost. This was someone who knew exactly why they were there. The camera recorded in silence. Moments later, everything changed. At first, the story felt easy to explain. A random act, a wrong turn, a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was the version people clung to because randomness feels safer than truth. Headlines repeated it until it sounded real. Random violence in broad daylight. A city shaken, a family destroyed. People shook their heads and said it could have been anyone. And then they went back to their lives comforted by the idea that chaos has no pattern, that if you live carefully enough, nothing like this will ever find you. But detectives don't live in comfort. They live in doubt. From the very beginning, something felt off. Crimes of chance are messy, loud, unpredictable. This one was. The killer's movements were clean, controlled, almost calm. And calm in moments like that is never accidental. So they stopped listening to the noise outside and started listening to the silence inside the case. They began where every real story hides, in the victim's life. On the surface, everything looked fine. A steady job, a modest home, a smiling family photo used by every news channel. But when investigators leaned closer, the cracks appeared quickly. Financial pressure had been building for months. Credit cards pushed to their limits. Bills stacked neatly but never fully paid. Long work hours that didn't quite match the paychecks coming in. Then there were the nights. Neighbors remembered the sounds, raised voices behind closed doors, doors slamming, lights switching on and off long after midnight, arguments that ended suddenly when footsteps passed outside. The kind of fights people hear but choose to ignore because getting involved feels uncomfortable. Friends noticed changes too. The victim had grown quieter, more distracted. He laughed less. He checked his phone constantly, then put it face down when someone entered the room. Coworkers described him as tense, on edge, like someone waiting for something bad to happen but unable to say why. And then there was the phone itself. Deleted messages don't erase the truth, they announce it. Investigators recovered fragments, partial conversations, missed calls made at strange hours. One contact name kept resurfacing in the data, then vanishing. Appearing just long enough to leave a trace, then disappearing again. Someone important, someone hidden. As the victim's private world came into focus, detectives returned to the footage. Frame by frame, second by second, they watched the killer again. The posture, the pace, the lack of hesitation. There was no scanning of the area, no sign of surprise. The timing was exact, as if the moment had been chosen carefully. This wasn't anger exploding. This was something rehearsed. Something decided long before that afternoon. That realization changed the direction of the case. Random violence doesn't wait for the perfect moment. Planned violence does. Slowly, inevitably, attention turned toward the person closest to the victim, the spouse. In public, grief poured out effortlessly. Press conferences filled with tears, a trembling voice, hands covering a face that cameras refused to look away from, statements about love, about loss, about a future stolen too soon. The performance was convincing, almost flawless. But detectives have learned something the rest of the world hasn't. Grief doesn't follow a script, and when it does, it deserves a second look. They replayed interviews the same way they replayed the footage, watching pauses, changes in tone, words chosen too carefully, stories that shifted slightly each time they were told, a timeline that bent just enough to raise suspicion, an alibi supported by details that sounded memorized rather than remembered. And then there were the silences, questions that went unanswered, topics quickly redirected, eyes that dropped at the wrong moments. Silence can scream when you know how to listen, and this silence was loud. As pressure mounted, the cracks widened. Friends who once defended the marriage began to hesitate. Some admitted they knew things weren't good. Others mentioned rumors they had dismissed at the time, an affair whispered about but never confirmed. A relationship carried on in shadows, hidden behind deleted messages and late-night calls. The idea felt unthinkable at first, the spouse as anything other than a victim, the person who stood at the funeral, who cried into microphones, who held photos of a life now gone. But detectives don't work with feelings, they work with facts, and the facts were pointing inward. Outside the investigation room, the public grew restless. Talk shows dissected every detail. Online forums turned into courtrooms without rules. Strangers argued fiercely over guilt and innocence. Some defended the spouse with absolute certainty, others accused with equal passion. Reputations were destroyed in comment sections. The case stopped being about truth and became about sides. And still, the most dangerous truth remained untouched, because the real story wasn't on the street. It wasn't in the footage. It wasn't even in the murder itself. It was in the quiet years before it. In the private arguments no one stopped. In the resentment that grew unnoticed. In the secrets shared with someone else while vows sat heavy and broken. In the belief that problems could be erased instead of faced. By the time detectives realized this wasn't a random act but a domestic one, the implications were terrifying. If this crime began at home, then the camera only captured the final chapter. Everything before it had been written slowly, deliberately, by people who knew each other intimately. And somewhere inside that hidden story, the truth was waiting, close. The turning point didn't arrive with flashing lights or breaking news alerts. It came quietly. The kind of quiet that changes everything once you notice it. It started with something small, so small most people would have missed it. A digital footprint buried inside thousands of records, a financial transaction that didn't belong, a payment made at an unusual hour, not large enough to trigger alarms, not small enough to be meaningless, just enough to ask a question. Then came the location ping, a phone signal that placed someone where they claimed they had never been. A few minutes, a narrow window, but time when measured correctly can destroy a lie completely. Detectives leaned closer, pulled harder on the thread, and that's when they found it. A deleted message, recovered fragment by fragment, incomplete, jagged, like a sentence torn out of a diary and burned. But one line survived, clear, undeniable. It has to happen today. No context, no explanation, no names attached, just intent, heavy, final. There was no way to misunderstand it. This wasn't fear speaking. This wasn't panic. This was a decision. When investigators placed that sentence next to the footage, next to the payment, next to the phone records, the picture stopped being confusing. It became unbearable. This wasn't a crime of passion. There was no sudden rage, no breaking point in the heat of an argument. This was colder than that. More deliberate. It was a contract. An agreement reached quietly, far away from the street where the blood would later spill. Late-night calls whispered in empty rooms. Conversations held just above silence. Plans spoken carefully, using words that felt safer than the truth. Love, once promised, had slowly decayed into resentment. Trust had been replaced by secrecy. And somewhere along the way, someone convinced themselves that ending a life was easier than ending a marriage. The confrontation was inevitable. It happened in a small room, neutral walls, a table that suddenly felt too close, the air thick with everything that had been left unsaid for years. Detectives didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. The evidence spoke loudly enough. At first, the spouse played their role perfectly. Confusion, tears ready on cue, shock that looked convincing from a distance. But then the questions changed, became sharper, more precise. Timelines tightened. Contradictions were placed gently but firmly on the table. Silence stretched, longer than before, heavy, uncomfortable, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, and then something shifted, the tears stopped. The posture changed, the face hardened. The crack didn't come with sorrow, it came with anger. Anger at being cornered, anger at being misunderstood, anger at years of frustration finally exposed. And anger, detectives know, tells the truth faster than grief ever will. Words slipped out that couldn't be pulled back. Accusations, justifications, a bitterness that had been buried beneath smiles and public affection. The story that emerged wasn't about love gone wrong. It was about control, about fear of losing status, fear of shame, fear of starting over. That fear had found a solution. The killer was identified soon after. Not a stranger, not a random criminal lurking in the shadows. A connection that shocked the public but made devastating sense to investigators. Someone
I
who had
just
been
want my
introduced
family to be
quietly,
safe.
trusted just enough.
These
Someone who
allegations
needed
are
money, someone
heartbreaking, and I
willing to listen.
promise you, I
Money
will
had
clear my
changed
name.
hands, not all at once, not dramatically. Small transfers, spread out, careful. Promises were made that regret would never follow, that everything would be clean, quick, final. They were wrong. When the arrest was announced, the nation didn't celebrate. It stared, in disbelief. Not because the crime was solved, but because of who stood accused of setting it in motion. The spouse, the same person who had stood at the funeral trembling behind dark glasses, the one who spoke of love into microphones, the one who described a future that would now never happen, the person who slept beside the victim for years, sharing meals, sharing secrets, sharing a life that had already begun to rot from the inside. People replayed those interviews with new eyes. Every tear looked different. Every word sounded hollow. The footage from the street felt even colder now, knowing what led up to it. The camera had shown the end, a body on the ground, a figure walking away, a life erased in seconds. But now the beginning was visible, clearer than ever. And it was far more disturbing than the violence itself, because it wasn't born from chaos. It was born from calculation, from the slow erosion of morality. From choices made repeatedly, quietly, until murder felt like a solution instead of a line never to be crossed. The case changed the way people looked at trust, at marriage, at the idea that danger always comes from outside. It forced a question no one wanted to ask. How well do we really know the people closest to us? As the legal process moved forward, one truth lingered heavily in the air. Justice might punish the crime. It might name the guilty. But it would never undo the years of deception that made it possible. And for the family left behind, for the children who would one day learn what happened, the real sentence had already been handed down. Because the most terrifying part wasn't that a murder was caught on camera. It was that it was planned in silence. Courtrooms are colder than streets, not because of temperature, but because hope doesn't survive well inside them. There is no sunlight pouring through windows, no movement. No noise except the quiet shuffle of papers and the distant echo of footsteps that sound heavier than they should. Everyone sits still, waiting for words that cannot fix anything. Words that can only name what has already been destroyed. When the verdict is read, it lands without drama. No gasps, no cheers, no sense of victory, just a thick, suffocating silence. Justice has spoken, but justice does not bring people back. It does not rewind time. It does not erase the image burned into millions of minds. It only assigns responsibility to a tragedy that already happened. The victim's family doesn't celebrate. They stare forward, empty, exhausted. Grief doesn't end when a case is solved. It only changes shape. It becomes quieter, heavier, more permanent. Across the room, the person who once shared a home with the victim sits motionless. The same hands that once prepared meals, the same voice that once whispered good night, now reduced to a name followed by a sentence. The distance between who they were and what they became feels impossible to measure. The footage is played one last time, not for shock, not for headlines, but for truth.
The
The
evidence is clear,
courtroom
Mrs.
watches in
Sharma.
silence as the
We
same
know you
moments
were there.
unfold again. The
It's
calm
time to tell us
approach,
what really
the brief
happened.
pause, the act that ends everything. This time, no one looks away, because now they understand what they are seeing, not just a murder, but the final step in a long chain of choices. The screen goes dark. Violence, the court reminds everyone, does not always wear a mask. It does not always come from strangers hiding in shadows. Sometimes it sits across the dinner table. Sometimes it signs greeting cards. Sometimes it smiles for photos while planning an ending no one else knows is coming. Sometimes it wears a wedding ring. That truth is the hardest to accept, because it means danger doesn't always announce itself. It means love can be weaponized. It means betrayal doesn't always arrive suddenly. It grows quietly, fed by resentment, fear, and secrets that feel safer than honesty. This case forces an uncomfortable reflection. How many warning signs were ignored because they felt ordinary, arguments brushed off as just stress, control disguised as concern, jealousy mistaken for passion, silence mistaken for peace. The slow erosion of respect explained away as a phase. People want evil to be obvious, loud, messy, easy to spot. But real evil is patient. It plans when no one is watching. It waits until routines feel safe and predictable. It relies on the belief that familiarity equals security. And when that belief goes unchallenged, the damage can be irreversible. This case didn't just shock a nation. It changed how people looked at trust, at marriage, at the stories we tell ourselves about safety. Neighbors became more attentive. Friends asked harder questions. Some people recognized pieces of their own lives reflected uncomfortably in the evidence, not because they were capable of
Keep moving!
violence,
Secure the
but
vehicle!
because they had ignored the same small
Did you steal the
signs.
money? Tell us the
The
truth.
No
camera
comment.
became
Get
a
back.
symbol, cold, silent, unemotional. It didn't intervene. It didn't judge. It simply watched. And in doing so, it did what humans often fail to do. It paid attention. It remembered. It told the truth exactly as it happened, without excuses or denial. That camera gave a voice to someone who lost theirs. It preserved a moment that could not be explained away. It made sure the ending could never be rewritten. But the camera did not cause the crime. People did. And that is the moral that lingers long after the courtroom empties, long after the headlines fade, long after the footage stops circulating. The most chilling part of this story isn't that a murder was caught on camera. It's that it was allowed to happen long before the camera ever started recording. It happened in the moments when honesty was replaced with secrecy, when resentment went unspoken, when fear of change outweighed respect for life, when someone chose control over compassion, when leaving felt harder than destroying. Those choices don't make noise, they don't trigger alarms, but they shape outcomes just the same. As people exit the courthouse, the street outside feels different now. Louder, brighter, fragile. Life moves forward again just like it did that afternoon. Cars pass, people walk. The world continues, unaware of how thin the line really is between ordinary and unthinkable. And somewhere a camera keeps recording, silent, patient, unblinking, waiting not to shock us but to remind us, pay attention, dangerously close, but not yet ready to come out. The victim stepped into view seconds before it happened, a familiar face to the neighborhood. The kind of man people recognized but didn't really know. He lived nearby, worked hard, paid his bills, he waved sometimes, smiled politely, a husband, a father, a man with routines so ordinary they felt invisible. He believed he was safe, safe because it was daylight, safe because people were around, safe because danger, we like to believe, announces itself. It doesn't. The approach was slow, almost respectful. Two lives crossing paths in a space neither of them would leave the same. The camera caught the brief pause, the half second where the victim seemed to sense something wrong but didn't yet understand what it was. That moment when instinct whispers but logic
In the
tells you
case
to
of the
ignore it.
state versus the
Then the
defendant,
irreversible
on the
act.
charge of
It
murder,
happened
we, the
faster than the
jury,
brain
find you
could
guilty as
process,
charged.
faster than anyone nearby could react. A burst of movement, a flash of violence, a sound swallowed by traffic noise. The victim collapsed onto concrete that had seen thousands of footsteps but never this much blood. The camera kept recording. The frame shook slightly from the impact. Then stillness, absolute stillness. The killer didn't run, didn't look back, just walked away, calmly, casually, as if they had finished buying groceries, as if they had checked something off a list. Behind them, a life drained out in the open air while strangers continued past, unsure of what they were seeing, unsure if this was real. Some slowed down, some stopped, some looked away. The world kept moving. When emergency sirens finally arrived, the damage was already done. Yellow tape cut the street into pieces. Police voices filled the air. Questions flew in every direction. But the answers were already sealed inside that camera's memory. When the footage surfaced days later, the country froze. Millions watched it once, then again, each replay slower than the last, pausing, zooming, studying body language, analyzing shadows, asking the same question in 1,000 different ways. How could this happen in front of everyone? How could so many people be there and yet no one stop it? The shock wasn't just the violence. It was the setting, broad daylight, a public street. No darkness to hide behind. No alley, no empty road, just normal life as the backdrop for something unthinkable. The victim's name filled headlines. His photo spread across screens. Smiling, family beside him. A life summarized in a few sentences. People mourned a man they never met. Candles appeared on the sidewalk where he fell. Flowers wilted in the heat. Strangers whispered prayers as they passed. But while the public focused on what the camera showed, investigators focused on what it didn't. They watched the footage again, not for shock, but for intention. The killer's calm became impossible to ignore. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't rage. There was no argument, no struggle, just execution. The kind of certainty that doesn't come from impulse. The kind that comes from planning. That realization changed everything. Behind the scenes, detectives began asking quieter questions. Questions about the victim's life away from the street, about his home, his marriage, his phone, his habits. They spoke to neighbors who remembered raised voices late at night, coworkers who mentioned stress he never explained, friends who noticed he had grown distant, distracted, as if carrying a weight he couldn't share. Then there was the spouse. Grief poured out in public, tears, statements, a face etched with loss. But grief, investigators knew, can be real and still hide something else beneath it. They listened closely, not just to what was said, but to what wasn't. Timelines blurred, small details shifted, answers came too quickly, too perfectly rehearsed. And then came the silence. The phone records, messages deleted, calls made at odd hours, names that appeared and disappeared like ghosts, hints of another life running parallel to the one shown to the world. An affair whispered about but never confirmed. Arguments that ended abruptly when someone walked into the room. The camera had captured the ending, but the beginning was unfolding somewhere else. As the nation obsessed over the footage, a darker story began to take shape behind closed doors. One rooted not in randomness but in betrayal. Not in chance but in choice. A story where love curdled into resentment, where promises turned into pressure, where escape felt impossible to someone who wanted control. The street murder was only the surface. Beneath it lay secrets carefully hidden for years, a domestic war fought quietly, a missing honesty that mattered more than a missing person, a truth that once exposed would shatter more than one life. The camera never blinked, but someone somewhere had looked away for far too long. And as investigators moved closer to the truth, one thing became clear. The most dangerous moment wasn't caught on camera. It was still waiting to be revealed.